Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today, we're going to be talking about one of the coolest, most interesting, and also most problematic cards out of Double Masters. I am talking about Cryptic Spires. Let's get started. First, we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the rules aspects of working with this card. So, when you're building your deck, you're going to have to choose two colors for Cryptic Spires. And we'll talk a little bit more in the future about exactly what you have to physically do to choose those colors, but once you do, those are considered to be part of the printed characteristics of this card, which means that they're going to affect both the copyable information of Cryptic Spires and also what the color identity of Cryptic Spires is. So let's take a look at some of the consequences that has with interactions between Cryptic Spires and some other cards. Let's say you copied a Cryptic Spires with a Vesuva. Because the copyable information includes the two colors that were chosen, that means that when you tap that Vesuva for mana, you're going to get the ability to add either of the two colors that was chosen with the original Cryptic Spires. You don't get to choose two new colors when the Vesuva enters, and you also don't get stuck tapping for 0 mana, which is something that could happen in some other situations. So for an example of that, let's consider what might happen if we had a Cryptic Spires and a Manascape Refractor. The Manascape Refractor doesn't copy the entire text of what the Cryptic Spires has the way that the Vesuva did. It only copies the activated ability that taps for mana. So what that means is that because that activated ability that taps for mana is linked to the ability where you choose two colors, well, that means that we aren't going to be copying the whole thing. We only are going to copy the thing that says you get to add mana, but we didn't copy the thing that let us choose what two colors that the mana would be. And so because we only have half of that pair of linked abilities, when you tap the Manascape for the mana, you're not going to get any mana at all, because it's not going to be able to identify what the colors that were chosen would be. So that's kind of counterintuitive, but it's not super duper terrible, and there's some other stuff that has similar rulings that you can refer to. However, the policy surrounding this card is actually really unique. This is actually the first time that we've had something that chooses a color during deck building. Now, we've had some kind of similar stuff before with conspiracies, but at least those were all in the command zone, which means that you could just write the thing that you chose on a small piece of paper and put it next to the conspiracy and reveal it at the appropriate time. And we also had some cards like this, but fortunately Wizards had the sense to make it so that each regicide has the exact same colors set for it. So you don't have to keep track of which three colors each individual regicide you might control has. You just need to keep track of all of the regicides together have this set of colors that they can affect. Now, in contrast, the Cryptic Spires has to be shuffled into your deck. So the thing that you choose has to be able to move around with it. Also, with the Cryptic Spires, you have individual choices for what the two colors are for each individual Cryptic Spires, which has some consequences that we'll see later. So let's talk a little bit about what you have to physically do to indicate the colors on Cryptic Spires. So there's two philosophical things that we need to take care of. First of all, we need to make sure that when you mark, it has to be clear and unambiguous which two colors you're choosing. And we also have to make sure that it's not possible to identify which cards are your Cryptic Spires without looking at the front face of them. So there were two ways that I've seen that were officially endorsed by official sources. And those would be either playing with sleeves and putting small pieces of paper that have your choices written on them and putting them in the sleeve, or physically marking the cards to indicate what the two colors would be. Now, both of those are definitely going to be okay as far as clear and unambiguous marking because they were, of course, officially endorsed. However, both of them also could have some potential issues on the other front. For example, if you had small pieces of paper in your sleeves, that might affect the thickness of the cards. So you'd have to make sure that it was not possible to determine which of them was a Cryptic Spires based on being a little bit thicker than all the others. In the same way, if you had a pen and you used it to circle the colors on the Cryptic Spires, well, that might cause some sort of a defacement on the front surface of the card that could also stab through into the back face. And so it might be possible to feel a bump or see a bump that's raised up on the back face that came from pushing down on the pen too hard. So the method that I like to recommend to people is to use some sort of a permanent marker and make those marks on the Cryptic Spires using that. And with that, you do also have a couple of issues, but it does dodge the problems that we talked about before. The issues that I could see with the permanent marker would be, of course, that most people probably aren't already taking a permanent marker to a Magic tournament, so you would have to bring an extra piece of gear. And also, you would need to be really sure that the ink was completely dry and give it lots of time to have that happen, because you definitely would not want the ink smearing off on the inside of your sleeves, or even worse, on another Magic card that you happen to stack on top of it or shuffle up next to it. The other kind of big issue that could come up with the permanent marker thing would be that it would be really difficult to change your mind about what the two colors were supposed to be and indicate that in a clear and unambiguous way. And did you say change your mind about what colors you are? That's exactly right. Because it turns out that in events that use continuous construction, it is possible for you to change your mind about what two colors your Cryptic Spires taps for before the start of every game. Now, what does continuous construction mean? Well, basically, if you're playing in a limited event with no deck lists at regular rel, then it's possible to be playing with continuous construction, which means that the specific configuration of your main deck does not have to go back to any one particular configuration for the first game of every match. Rather, you can change what your main deck is so long as you follow all the other normal Magic deck building rules, and your main deck can be whatever you want at the beginning of every round. So that means that you could maybe be playing a completely different color deck, or if some specific card isn't really pulling its weight, you could switch it out for another one that you like better, and you wouldn't have to go back to the original configuration for game one. You could just say, well, this is my deck from now on. And of course, that works out pretty well in that sort of environment, that being regular rel and limited environment, and of course with no deck lists. So if you have a tournament like that, then you probably are dealing with an environment where you can do that continuous construction. It is of course possible that the judge or TO might announce ahead of time that you are not using that option, in which case of course you wouldn't be able to. I've never seen or heard of a case where that happens, but it certainly is allowed, and I wouldn't want someone to get confused and fall into some trouble because I didn't mention it here. Now, how can you tell if your event is using continuous construction? Well, it needs to be a limited event, and you can't be using deck lists, and you also have to be at regular rel. So if any of those is not the case, then you are not using continuous construction. However, if all those are the case, and you didn't hear an announcement that said otherwise, then you are using continuous construction. And that means that you can change what colors your Cryptic Spires tap for before the start of every game. I guess the thinking is that because you're allowed to change the contents of your deck, and because you're allowed to make the decision of what colors you tap for while you're building your deck, then that kind of counts as the same sort of thing, so you would be able to change your mind about what colors you tap for also. Now, of course, the really interesting part from a policy perspective would be if you are not at an event with continuous construction. This makes Cryptic Spires, as far as I'm aware, the only card right now in Magic that can change its functionality based on what kind of a tournament that you're playing it in. Because if you are playing in an event that does not use continuous construction, that means that you are not able to change what your Cryptic Spires taps for. Rather, you're locked in to whatever choice you made at the very beginning of the day before you played any games of Magic. You have to make a choice for every single Cryptic Spires that's available to you, and if your event is using deck lists, those choices need to be indicated both on the physical card and also on the deck list. While we're on the topic, I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about exactly what you physically need to do to mark on your deck list what colors you're playing. If you're doing a constructed event, then it's probably not going to be that hard or that big of a deal. You would probably just write with each of the Cryptic Spires what you're playing. Now, I don't really expect that to come up very much, but I do expect it to come up a whole lot in Limited. And the reason for that is because even though it would be crazy for someone to want to use these types of cards in a competitive rel limited event, it just so happens that Double Masters Sealed is indeed a valid format for RCQs, and those are by default, of course, held at competitive rel. So this is definitely the sort of environment that I could see that sort of thing coming up in. So the problem is that if you take a look at the deck list for the Double Masters, you're going to see that, well, there isn't a specific spot for you to say what the Cryptic Spires is. Now, it also is the case that there's not a whole lot of room on this deck list either. So what I've said is that maybe you could use this specific spot in the deck list, and that would be where you could write in pretty small letters exactly what your Cryptic Spires are tapping for. Another idea would be maybe you could use the back of the deck list, but if you're going to do that, I would highly recommend making some sort of a note on the front of the deck list so that people don't think that you forgot. Alright, so with that being the case, let's take a look at some of the situations that could come up if a player makes a mistake or forgets to register both on the deck or the deck list what the colors that their Cryptic Spires can tap for would be. First of all, let's say that Amy is playing a Cryptic Spires and it's noticed that there's nothing marked on the Cryptic Spires. So, with this being the case, what would be the appropriate infraction, penalty, and fix? So there's actually a couple of possibilities here. We'll start off with the easiest and most straightforward one, that being that Amy only has one kind of Cryptic Spires that is in her deck, and she correctly marked it on her deck list, so if that's the case, then it would be a warning for a deck problem. We're giving a deck problem here because the problem is actually with Amy's deck. Her deck list is actually perfectly fine. So, with that warning, we're of course going to have Amy correct these cards so that it says the colors that she actually chose. And we're going to of course use her deck list as the reference for that. We're going to probably want to do all of the ones that she has as Cryptic Spires and correct all of them at the same time if there's not some sort of other compelling reason to do so, because that way you won't have to have another judge call a few minutes later with the exact same issue. Now, it gets a little bit more interesting if Amy is actually playing two different kinds of Cryptic Spires. So maybe she has a blue-white Cryptic Spires and a blue-black Cryptic Spires. So if that's the case, then we're still going to be giving her a warning for a deck problem, and we're still going to be marking the Cryptic Spires as shown on her deck list. However, this time we have to have the additional wrinkle of knowing which of the two Cryptic Spires Amy is going to get as the one that she has in her hand, and which one is the one that she has still in her library. And the decision of that is going to be up to the opponent of the player. And so the opponent is going to have the opportunity to say, this is the Cryptic Spires that we're going to put in your hand, and this is the one that we're going to have go back to take the spot of the one that was in your library. So that makes sense, and that seems pretty fair. However, the third situation is a little bit more harsh. So let's say we have the exact same thing going on, except this time it's not noticed until a few turns later that Amy has not marked something on the Cryptic Spires that she played. Now, I've got to say, I personally don't think this situation is going to come up very often because, especially if someone is playing a Cryptic Spires and they have multiple different types of Cryptic Spires, then the first thing that you're probably going to do when you draw a Cryptic Spires is to look to see which colors this one taps for. And the same thing is probably going to be true most of the time when you play Cryptic Spires. The first thing your opponent is going to ask is, what colors does that one tap for? So if Amy plays a Cryptic Spires, and it's not noticed until sometime later after the opponent has made significant game decisions about that Cryptic Spires being in play, and also if Amy has more than one type of Cryptic Spires in her deck, then we're going to have the same issue, which is a deck problem, but this time the penalty is going to be getting upgraded to a game loss. And the reasoning behind that is that it's not allowed for players to use ambiguity in their cards in a way that gives them an advantage. And getting to sandbag for a couple of turns is definitely an advantage, and so that's the reason why the philosophy here should give you a harsher penalty. So that's the sort of situations that you could come up with where a player didn't mark the card appropriately. Now let's take a look at what sort of situations could happen if the player does not mark their deck list appropriately. And this one is a little bit more simple and straightforward. There's only really one situation here, which is it comes out somehow, it doesn't really matter how, that a player doesn't have marked on their deck list a choice for every single Cryptic Spires that they have. And if that's discovered, then we need to change their deck list to say what the choice for the Cryptic Spires is, and what that would mean is that we're going to be getting a deck list problem. The problem is not with the deck we're going to assume is perfectly fine for now, but the problem is with the deck list. And unfortunately, a deck list problem has a default penalty of a game loss. The deck list is meant to be the written record of all the cards that you're playing, so any problems with the deck list are necessarily punished a little bit harsher because you have a lot more potential to gain an advantage from having some ambiguity there. Finally, I wanted to give a little bit of a word of caution when you're having a situation like this. If Amy's opponent knows about this policy, then that means that they would be pretty incentivized to not pull any attention to the fact that the Cryptic Spires was marked until after some amount of time had been passed. That way, they could effectively upgrade the penalty that Amy is getting from just a warning to an actual game loss. If this is what you think happened, then that means that Amy's opponent has not called attention to a mistake that they saw in the game and did that in hopes of getting some sort of an advantage for themselves. That would fall under the game's definition of cheating and would need to be punished appropriately. So, if you're a judge and you're having this sort of situation happen, you definitely want to investigate at what point the opponent was first aware of the fact that the Cryptic Spires did not have anything marked on it. And you would want to ask some hard questions about why they didn't call any attention to this sooner or why they didn't notice it sooner. Alright, so we've talked about what would happen if the deck was wrong and what would happen if the deck list was wrong. The one other situation that I want to talk about now is what would happen if there's a mismatch between what's written down on the physical card and what's written down on the deck list. So, for example, maybe we would find a situation where Amy said that she had a white-blue Cryptic Spires and a white-black Cryptic Spires on her deck list, but maybe the ones that she actually physically has in her deck would be a white-blue Cryptic Spires and a blue-black Cryptic Spires. So in this case, what's written down on the deck list and what the physical cards say do not match. And in this situation, we would need to investigate to see exactly what Amy intended to play. Based on this, the infraction could either be a deck problem or a deck list problem, depending on which of them is incorrect and needs to be amended. If the physical cards are found to be an error, that is, if Amy intended to play what she wrote on the deck list, then that would fit under a deck problem, and we would modify what it said on the physical cards in order to match the deck list, which was correct. This would be a warning, just like the deck problem that we had earlier. On the other hand, if Amy's deck list needs to be amended, then that would be a deck list problem. So if the physical cards are right and Amy wants to change her deck list to match what that says, then that would be a game loss. Because again, the default penalty for a deck list problem is a little bit harsher because of the fact that there's more advantage to be gained and there's less chance that someone could figure out that there was a problem with that. Whew, that was a lot of information. Give yourselves a big pat on the back if you were able to hang through all of that. Now, as a final closing note, I wanted to point out that again, there's not a lot of stuff written in our actual Magic rules and policy documents about this card. A lot of the information that I just presented here is adapted from some articles that were released through either official Wizards or Judge Academy channels, and I'll give you a link to those articles in the description if that's something you'd like to read further on. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.